All right, let's get right into it. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're peeling back the layers of what is universally recognized as the world's very first modern novel, Miguel de Cervantes' absolute masterpiece, Don Quixote. Now look, I know a 1,000-page book from the 1600s sounds, well, pretty intimidating. But don't worry, rather than just doing a basic summary, we're going to dive into a complete structural analysis. Using some incredible, high-quality AI-generated visuals to break down these concepts, we'll explore the incredible depth, that biting humor, and the profound tragedy of the story. We're going to give you the full analysis without you having to actually sit down and read all 1,000 pages.
Okay, let's dive into this. It's totally fascinating how, right from page 1, this book completely blurs the line between reality and fantasy. Cervantes doesn't just come out and say, hey, here's a story I made up. No way. He claims he's merely recounting a factual history that he stumbled upon. But then, and here's the kicker, he refuses to even name the village where our hero lives. So by constantly interrupting his own story to remind us that it's supposedly historical fact, he ironically reminds us that it is entirely fiction. He essentially makes both the author and the protagonist absolute masters of self-deception.
To unpack exactly how he pulls this off, we've organized this explainer into 5 key areas. First, the chivalric parody. Second, the knight and his foil. Third, cruelty and social reality. Fourth, the illusion of authorship. And finally, number 5, the tragic return to sanity.
So, layer 1, the chivalric parody, fighting windmills and forcing reality.
This right here is the surface layer that most people are already somewhat familiar with. A chivalric parody is basically a comedic mockery of traditional heroic tales. See, back in the 1600s, people were absolutely obsessed with these highly unrealistic books about knights doing impossible superhuman deeds. And Cervantes, well, he set out to mock the whole trend. When our hero, who's just this eccentric 50-year-old gentleman, decides to literally become a knight, his adventures don't bring him any treasure or glory. Far from it. His first outing is a complete disaster. He rolls up to a rundown inn completely convinced it's a grand castle, and he mistakes 2 ordinary prostitutes for noble princesses. It's hilarious, but it really highlights the total absurdity of these outdated knightly ideals when they crash headfirst into the grimy, realistic world.
Let's actually track his initial descent into madness here. So at age 50, he reads so many of these fantasy books, he literally loses his mind. Just snaps. On day 1, he polishes up this rusty old family armor and renames his incredibly skinny horse Rocinante. By day 2, he's being mockingly knighted by a scheming innkeeper who honestly just wants the guy to leave. And then, by day 3, we hit that famous moment we all know. He charges at a field of windmills because he is entirely convinced they're terrifying giants. But you know what's really fascinating about this? When his lance gets caught in the sail and he's violently thrown into the dirt, he still doesn't admit he was wrong. No, he continually constructs elaborate stories to explain away reality, basically claiming that an evil enchanter turned those giants into windmills at the very last second just to deny him the glory.
Which brings us to layer number 2, the knight and his foil, the idealist and the realist.
And this brilliantly illustrates the literary device known as a foil. That's a character who directly contrasts with another to highlight specific traits. Cervantes was smart. He knew a madman just wandering around alone wasn't going to hold up an entire novel. So he introduces Sancho Panza, a simple-minded peasant whose utter normality perfectly highlights his master's incredibly complex madness.
I mean, look at these 2. They are opposites on absolutely every fundamental level. Don Quixote is tall, he's gaunt, and he happily endures fasting and severe physical beatings for his quote-unquote knightly duty. Sancho, on the flip side, is short, a bit pudgy, loves a good meal, and is driven entirely by common sense and the promise of eventually getting an island governorship. Sancho is our anchor here. He reacts to Quixote exactly the way you or I would, which really grounds the narrative for us as readers.
But here's the thing, Sancho is way more than just comedic relief. He actively straddles the line between the real world and the fictional world. What makes his characters so compelling is that he actually sees the truth. He knows the windmills are just windmills. He knows Quixote's imaginary beautiful princess Dulcinea is actually just a local peasant girl. Yet, he still buys into the delusion whenever it benefits him. He actively participates in the fantasy while remaining fully aware of reality.
All right, moving on to layer 3, cruelty and social reality, the shift from comedy to malice. So, as the novel transitions from part 1 to part 2, there is this stark, almost disturbing shift in how the rest of the world reacts to Quixote's madness. In part 1, the violence is mostly slapstick comedy, right? Quixote gets into brawls with innkeepers or goat herds, and it's largely accidental. But in part 2, Cervantes introduces the Duke and the Duchess. These are extremely wealthy nobles who actually recognize Quixote and Sancho from reading the first book, and they decide to humor their fantasies. But it is definitely not out of kindness. They stage these elaborate, calculated, and honestly physically harmful ruses strictly for their own haughty amusement. I mean, they even grant Sancho a fake governorship as this massive, cruel prank, essentially treating these two men like pawns or literal animals for entertainment. It's a razor-sharp critique of class and privilege in Spanish society.
Yet Cervantes pulls off this absolutely incredible reversal here. Despite their peasant status, Sancho and his wife Teresa rise completely above the pettiness of the nobles. When Sancho actually takes over this fake governorship, he doesn't fail like they planned. Instead, he relies on his own common sense and some surprisingly brilliant advice given to him by Quixote, and he rules the town with incredible wisdom and leniency. He creates laws that are so good they are literally kept by the town forever. And then, when the burden of the office just becomes too much, he peacefully gives it up with total humility. He completely upends the era's conventional wisdom that noble blood somehow equates to personal worth.
Layer 4. The Illusion of Authorship. Cervantes' Metafictional Genius. Now we are getting to the absolute core of the text's structural genius. We're talking about metafiction, a story that explicitly draws attention to its own artificiality. This is where Don Quixote stops being just a funny story about a crazy guy in armor and starts becoming a story about storytelling itself. The novel is constantly reminding us that what we are reading is a constructed narrative, totally vulnerable to human error, bias, and distortion.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when you map out the narrator layers, it's actually wild how much distance Cervantes puts between us and the story. First, there's Cervantes himself, playing this sort of unreliable scholar who claims he just found these texts. Then, he claims the true original author is an Arabic historian named Sidi Hamid Benengeli, who Cervantes frequently blames whenever there's a plot hole or inconsistency. And on top of all that, there's an unnamed Christian translator who was supposedly hired to translate the Arabic parchments, adding yet another layer of potential distortion to the whole thing. So it begs this hilarious and genuinely confusing question: who is actually telling the story of Don Quixote? There is this one part in the first book where a dramatic sword fight is happening and Cervantes literally stops the narrative mid-swing. He jumps in and says the historical manuscript he was reading just ran out of pages right there, and we literally have to wait while he goes to a market in Toledo to find the rest of the manuscript. By forcing us to question the validity of the text during its most dramatic moments, Cervantes is brilliantly critiquing the authenticity of all heroic myths and tales. And this metafiction becomes completely mind-bending in part 2. Because part 2 is published 10 years after part 1, the characters inside the story have already read the first book. People meet Don Quixote and they already know exactly who he is because they bought his book. Furthermore, in the real world, a rival author named Avellaneda actually wrote a fake, unauthorized sequel to Don Quixote before Cervantes could even finish his own. Cervantes was so mad about this that he wrote this real-life fake book right into his actual story. The characters in the novel talk about the fake book, and at one point, Don Quixote flat out refuses to travel to the city of Saragossa strictly to prove the author of the fake sequel wrong. The characters literally realize they are in a book, and the physical world begins imitating Quixote's fantasies.
And that brings us to our fifth and final layer: tragic return to sanity, the climax and resolution.
As we move towards the climax of the explainer, the humor really begins to strip away. If we track Quixote's final timeline, we see a tragic physical and psychological decline. He reaches the absolute peak of his imagination when he descends into Montesino's cave, claiming he spent 3 days in this gorgeous crystal palace when he was really just asleep in a hole for half an hour. But soon after, reality violently pushes back. He is literally crushed by a stampeding herd of bulls. Shortly after that, he is challenged and defeated in a duel by the Knight of the White Moon, who, spoiler alert, is actually just his neighbor in disguise, trying to force him to finally go home. Quixote loses, he's forced to retire, and this defeat completely saps his chivalric strength and his will to live. He falls into a fever, awakens entirely sane, and then tragically passes away. But the true tragedy here is not just his death, it's his sanity. On his deathbed, Quixote completely renounces chivalry. He finally acknowledges the tragedy of trying to live a romantic, ideal life in a cruel, deeply imperfect world. But the problem is, his return to sanity effectively erases his entire identity. Once the knight-errant within him dies, his physical body simply cannot survive the real world. And in this incredibly heartbreaking reversal of roles, it is Sancho Panza, the ultimate realist, who begs Quixote to get out of bed and keep adventuring. By the end of it all, Cervantes achieves something truly miraculous. He explicitly stated that his goal was to destroy the ridiculous genre of chivalric romances by showing everyone how absurd they are. Yet, in doing so, he accidentally immortalized the greatest knight of them all. He elevates Don Quixote to this incredibly heroic, deeply sympathetic status. Quixote's physical body dies, yes, but his unwavering dedication to his noble ideals lives on with the reader forever. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought to chew on. Is it better to be a totally sane person in a cruel, cynical world, or a madman happily chasing a noble ideal? Just think about the journey we just took. That deep tension between reality and idealism is exactly why this story has endured for over 400 years. I really hope this explainer has given you a newfound appreciation for the layered genius of Don Quixote. Thanks so much for joining me today.